Centuries before Columbus raised his sails, a Viking had already set foot on the shores of America. His name was Leif Erikson, the son of an outlaw, the dreamer of horizons, the man who followed the whisper of the sea into the unknown. This is the Saga of Vinland. Long before maps were filled and oceans tamed, there lived men who feared no horizon. They were the Northmen, the Vikings, born of ice, iron, and storm. With dragon-headed ships they carved their way across the world's edge, chasing glory and land where none dared to sail. Among them, one name would echo through sagas like a hidden flame: Leif Erikson, son of the fiery outlaw Eric the Red. History would one day crown Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of a new world, yet centuries before his sails caught the wind, Leif had already set foot upon those distant shores. His tale lived not in royal chronicles, but in the smoky halls of Iceland, whispered in sagas that smelled of salt, blood, and fire. On the harsh and frozen soil of Greenland, Leif grew beneath the shadow of his father. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for blood feud, had defied the sea and found a home where the world seemed to end. His defiance forged a new land for his kin, but his son's heart was restless in a different way. Leif was not only a warrior of axe and shield, he was a seeker, a dreamer. The sea called to him in the dark of night. In his dreams he walked through lands bathed in soft sun, where grapes hung heavy on the vine, where forests whispered in tongues unknown, and the earth was rich and black beneath his hands. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he believed, lay a world untouched. This is where our saga begins, not with conquest, but with a journey. A journey of courage, fate, and a Viking who dared to follow the whisper of the sea into the unknown. Before Leif could dream of distant shores, there was his father, Erik Thorvaldsson, known to the world as Eric the Red. His story was carved in flame and blood, a saga of exile that shaped the fate of his son. Eric was a man of towering spirit, his hair the color of burning embers, his temper as fierce as the storms that tore across the North Atlantic. In Iceland, where honor was worth more than life itself, he struck down his enemies in a bitter feud. Steel clashed, blood ran, and though he claimed vengeance, the law of men condemned him. For 3 years, he was cast out, an outlaw, stripped of home and hearth. But exile did not break Eric. No, like Odin wandering the 9 worlds, he took to the sea, chasing whispers of a land no one had yet claimed. With only a few loyal men and their dragon-headed ships, he sailed westward, beyond the edge of fear. Days turned to weeks, storms beat upon them, and icebergs loomed like pale giants in the mist. Yet Eric's will was iron, and at last, land rose from the sea. It was a place of deep fjords and green valleys, hidden between glacier and stone. To men weary of Iceland's crowded fields, it seemed a gift from the gods themselves. Eric named it Greenland, not for its abundance, but for its promise. He knew words could bend fate, call a land a green, ere men would come. And they did. Families, warriors, dreamers, they followed Eric to the edge of the world, building homes of turf and timber where the sea met ice. But in the halls of his settlement, beneath flickering torchlight, stories grew of his son, Leif, quiet, sharp-eyed, unlike the raging fire of his father. Where Eric sought to conquer land, Leif gazed beyond it, toward horizons no man had touched. If Eric was the flame, Leif was the spark that would leap from it and ignite a new destiny. For it was in Eric's exile that Leif's journey was born. Without Greenland, there would be no path westward. Without the fire of the farther, the sun could not follow the whisper of the sea. On the edge of the known world, where mountains of ice groaned beneath the weight of endless winters, Leif Erikson was born. Greenland was no gentle cradle. It was a land where men and women wrestled survival from stone and snow. The earth was stingy, the sea merciless, and yet the Northmen endured, for hardship was the forge in which their spirit was tempered. Leif grew in the shadow of his father's fame, yet he was not shaped from the same fire. Where Eric the Red burned hot with fury and ambition, Leif was quiet, deliberate, his eyes always searching beyond the horizon. As a boy, he listened to the wind howl across the fjords, imagining it carried voices from distant lands. He studied the sagas sung by skalds in the smoky longhouses, tales of gods, giants, and heroes who ventured where no mortal dared. Greenland taught him patience and strength. In winter, he learned to hunt seal upon the frozen sea, their breaths steaming like ghosts against the pale sun. In summer, he worked the oars of the family ship, his arms hardening like oak. He mended nets, tended sheep, and watched the skies, learning the subtle shifts of wind and stars. But most of all, he learned that survival was not enough. Life demanded courage to seek more. At night, beneath the roof of turf and timber, he dreamed of warmth. He saw lands in his sleep where the earth was rich and dark, where rivers sang through green valleys, where grapes hung heavy on twisting vines. His dreams were not of gods or warriors, but of places no Northman had set foot upon. The settlers whispered that Leif was different, touched perhaps by fate. Some said the Norns, the weavers of destiny, had placed a thread in his hand that would lead him further than even his father had dared. Leif himself did not know. He only felt the pull, strong as the tide, calling him ever outward. And so, as Greenland hardened his body and sharpened his mind, the seeds of a greater journey were already taking root. The boy who gazed into the storm would one day follow it, into a world no Viking had ever seen. As Leif grew into manhood, the sea began to speak to him more clearly. It was no longer a whisper in dreams but a roar in his blood, urging him to leave the fjords of Greenland behind. The horizon, vast and untamed, became his obsession. To others, the edge of the ocean was the end of the world. To Leif, it was only the beginning. The young Viking had inherited his father's strength, but not his wrath. Where Eric the Red ruled with flame and fury, Leif's spirit was calmer, steady as the tide. He studied the stars, tracing their patterns as though the gods themselves had etched runes across the night sky. He watched the flight of seabirds, the swell of the waves, the taste of salt on the wind, all signs that spoke to those who dared to listen. But destiny does not arrive in silence. Rumors drifted across the sea from traders and wanderers. Tales of a land farther west than Greenland, a place of rich forests, broad rivers, and soil that could feed whole clans. Some said they were lies, drunken boasts traded in smoke-filled halls. Others swore they had glimpsed its shores when storms blew them off course. To Leif, these were not idle tales, they were prophecy. In the longhouse, while the fire cracked and shadows danced on timbered walls, he listened to the sagas of bold explorers. His eyes burned, not with the thirst for battle, but with longing. Greenland was strong, yes, but barren. The people needed more pasture, more timber, more hope. Leif began to believe that it was his fate to find it. And so the call of the sea grew louder with each season. Each wave that struck the shore was a drumbeat, each gull's cry an omen. The Norns, those unseen weavers of destiny, had spun his thread far beyond Greenland's icy shores. Soon, Leif knew he would take up his oars and sail into the unknown. The horizon waited, and with it, the first steps of a saga that would echo through 1,000 winters. The sea did not only carry whispers of distant lands, it also bore tidings of kings and new gods. When Leif Erikson reached the strength of his youth, he journeyed eastward across the Whale Road, leaving the raw wilderness of Greenland behind to seek the heart of the Viking world. His destination was Norway, the land of his ancestors, where fjords cut deep into the mountains and kings ruled with iron and gold. The voyage was perilous. Storms struck like hammer blows, waves rose like walls, and winds howled as though Odin himself tested his courage. Yet Leif stood firm at the prow, his hands steady on the oar, his eyes unblinking against the spray. For him, the sea was no enemy, it was a path, and the gods had set it before him. At last, his ship slipped into the harbours of Norway, where longhouses glowed like embers against the dark forests. Here, the world was richer, louder, and more dangerous than the frozen silence of Greenland. Kings feasted with warriors, skalds wove sagas in voices like thunder, and merchants brought treasures from lands so distant they seemed like dreams. But greater than gold or feasts was the new power rising in these halls, the White Christ, the God of the South. Missionaries spoke of a single Almighty who ruled the heavens, a God who offered not just strength but salvation. To many hardened Norsemen, it seemed strange, even weak. Yet to others, it carried a fire no sword could quench. Leif listened. He was no zealot, but his heart was open, his mind restless. The old gods had carried his people across seas and into battle, but here was a faith that spoke of mercy, destiny, and eternal life beyond the grave. The young Viking found himself torn between the hammer of Thor and the cross of Christ, between the sagas of his fathers and the whispers of something new. In the court of King Olaf Tryggvason, the fiery ruler who spread Christianity across the north with sword and sermon alike, Leif's fate was sealed. The king looked upon the tall, steadfast son of Eric the Red and saw not just a warrior, but a leader meant for greater things. It was here, beneath Norway's skies, that Leif's path shifted. His eyes were no longer fixed only on the horizon. Now, they carried the weight of faith, destiny, and a mission that would guide him westward into legend. In the great hall of King Olaf Tryggvason, the air burned with torchlight and song. Warriors clashed drinking horns, skalds sang of gods and battles, and at the high seat, the king's gaze swept the room like a blade. When his eyes fell upon Leif Erikson, tall and steadfast, he saw more than the son of an outlaw. He saw a man shaped by storm and silence, a vessel for destiny. Olaf was no ordinary king. His hand carried both sword and cross, and with them he sought to bind Norway to the new faith. He looked upon Leif with fire in his voice. "You are Eric's son," he said. "A man of Greenland, where the old gods still reign in shadow. Take with you the word of Christ. Carry it across the Whale Road, to your kin, to your people. Be my messenger at the edge of the world." For Leif, the king's words struck deep. To be chosen was an honor, yet also a burden. He had been raised in the sagas of Odin and Thor, the runes and the hammer, but here was a new calling, a mission not of conquest, but of faith. He accepted, not with blind devotion, but with the steady resolve of a man who sensed that fate was weaving something greater around him. Yet even as Olaf spoke of the White Christ, Leif's heart beat to another rhythm, the sea's rhythm. In smoky corners of the hall, traders and wanderers spoke of lands far beyond Greenland, where the forests stretched endlessly, where wild grapes grew in clusters, and rivers carried fish so thick they glimmered like silver. Some called it Markland, others Vinland. Most dismissed it as drunken fancy, yet to Leif it sounded like the voice of destiny itself. The king's mission and the sea's whisper became one. To sail westward was not only to spread faith, it was to seek the unknown, to test himself against the world's edge, to carve a new Saga from the bones of mystery. And so, with Olaf's blessing and the cross of Christ at his side, Leif began to gather his strength. Ships would be built, crews chosen, supplies prepared. For when the sea calls a man, no hall, no king, no guard can still the tide. Leif Erikson would return to Greenland, but not as a boy, nor merely as Eric's son. He would return as a man carrying both faith and fire, and beyond him, a horizon no Viking had yet dared to claim. The long ships cut through the cold waters of the North Atlantic, their dragon heads glinting in the pale sun, as Leif Erikson sailed back to Greenland. Years had passed since he left, and the frozen land had not softened. Its fjords still bit into the mountains, its glacier groaned like ancient beasts. Yet in Leif's heart, Greenland felt smaller now, constrained by familiarity, while his dreams had grown vast as the ocean. He arrived to the site of his father, Eric the Red, standing upon the ridge overlooking the settlement. The old man's hair, once like burning fire, had dulled to iron grey, his eyes still sharp, scanning the horizon as if he could see the edge of the world itself. When father and son met, there was no hug, no soft greeting, only the silent weight of history, of bloodlines, of destiny. "You have sailed the seas," Eric said, voice like gravel and storm. "You carry the word of a new god?" Leif met his father's gaze, steady and unflinching. "I carry faith and courage, farther. And beyond Greenland, there are lands the sagas speak of. Lands waiting for us." Eric's laugh was sharp, cutting the wind. "Faith will not soften the ice. Odin's hammer is stronger than any cross you bring. And these lands, perhaps they myths, fool's tales to tempt the daring." Yet Leif knew that the world had shifted. Greenland, though harsh and enduring, could no longer contain him. The clash of worlds, Thor versus Christ, old ways versus new, father versus son, was a storm as fierce as any the North Atlantic had thrown. But Leif was ready. Where Eric saw the edge, Leif saw a beginning. That night, fires burned long in the longhouses, and whispers of distant lands spread among the settlers. Leif spoke not of war, but of wonder, dense forests, rivers heavy with fish, and earth rich beneath untrodden skies. Some laughed, some scoffed, but in the hearts of the young and brave, a spark was lit. The stage was set. Beyond Greenland lay the unknown, and between father and son, between gods old and new, destiny waited, patient, silent, inevitable. Leif Erikson was no longer just the son of Eric the Red. He was the seeker, the voyager, the one who would dare to step where no Viking had stepped before. The morning mist clung to the fjords like a silken veil as Leif Erikson oversaw the building of the longships. Each vessel was a masterpiece of oak and iron, its dragon-headed prow carved with care, meant to strike ore into the hearts of both men and gods. Sails were woven tight, ropes coiled, and every plank inspected, for the North Atlantic brooked no mistakes. One crack, one loose nail, and the sea would claim its due. Leif handpicked his crew with care. Brave men of Greenland and Iceland, seasoned by storms and hungry for legend, stood at attention on the docks. Some were hardened warriors, others skilled sailors, but all shared the same spark, the same hunger for lands unseen. Among them were storytellers, men whose voices could calm fear and ignite courage, and hunters whose keen eyes and steady hands would prove vital in a world still wild and untamed. Before departure, Leif stood at the prow of the lead ship, staring out at the horizon that blurred into silver waves. The wind caught his cloak, the salt spray kissed his face, and he felt the sea thrumming beneath him like a living heart. "We sail not just for Greenland or Norway," he told his men. "We sail for discovery, for the unknown, for the lands that wait beyond the edge of the map." The first days at sea tested every man. Waves rose like walls, thunder rolled across the sky, and icy gusts tore at sails and skin alike. Men grew weary, doubts whispered like shadows across the deck. But Leif's calm resolve was unyielding. He navigated by stars, by seabirds, by the subtle swell of the ocean. Each night, he traced constellations. Each morning he listened to the wind, learning its moods, deciphering its messages. One night, a storm struck with fury. Waves crashed over the prow, hurling men and cargo alike. Fire from the torches flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the ships. Yet Leif remained steadfast, shouting commands with a voice that cut through the tempest. Men clung to ropes and to courage itself, and when dawn broke, they found themselves battered but unbroken, a testament to their skill and to their captain's indomitable will. So the voyage pressed on, long, perilous, yet filled with promise. Greenland receded into memory, Norway faded into legend, and ahead stretched only the vast, mysterious ocean. Somewhere beyond its silver waves lay Vinland, waiting silently for the first Viking foot to touch its shores. Days bled into nights, and the horizon remained a restless, silver line. The sea, once a faithful guide, now whispered of lands unseen. Then, at last, jagged cliffs rose from the mist, Helgeland, the land of flat stones. Its shores were barren, ice-kissed, and strange, yet beautiful in their harshness. Leif and his crew stepped onto the rocky beaches, their boots crunching on the pale stones, marveling at the untouched wilderness. Though Helgeland offered little in the way of sustenance, it was proof that the world stretched far beyond Greenland. Birds unknown circled above, their cries like riddles in the wind. Rivers ran cold and clear, feeding the frigid ocean with life. Leif's heart swelled with awe. Here was proof. The Sagas were true, and the unknown was within reach. From there, they sailed further south, toward a forested land called Markland, where dense trees rose like towers, their branches tangled with moss. Timber thick and strong promised a bounty for shipbuilders, rivers teemed with fish, and the air smelled of pine and fertile earth. For the crew, it was a land of promise, a whisper of warmth and abundance after the icy trials of Greenland. Yet signs of mystery lingered. Strange footprints along the shores hinted at inhabitants unknown, and shadows moved just beyond the tree line. The men whispered tales of Skraelings, mysterious people who might be friend or foe. Leif, ever cautious yet unafraid, recorded everything, mapping the coast, observing the land's gifts and dangers alike. As the days passed, the crew felt the pull of a greater prize further west. The sun dipped lower, the forests thickened, and the scent of fertile soil grew stronger. They knew Vinland awaited, a land whispered in the wind, sung in sagas, yet unseen by any Viking eye. Leif stood at the prow of his ship, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Helgeland and Markland were only the prelude, the first verses of a story that will be carved in stone and memory. Beyond them lay the heart of mystery, Where forests stretched endlessly, rivers sang, and destiny waited for those daring enough to claim it. The morning mist lay heavy over Vinland as Leif Erikson's ships glided into the sheltered bay. The forest loomed like a living cathedral, sunlight filtering through towering trees and casting emerald patterns upon the waves. For days, the men had sailed over calm waters, lulled by the scent of pine and the promise of fertile land, but now the air thrummed with a tension they could not name. Then they saw them. Figures moving among the trees, watching, silent and wary. The Skraelings, as the Sagas would call them, were unlike any people the Vikings had seen. Small of stature, their skin dark against the sun-dappled forest, eyes sharp and alert, they carried spears and bows. A language unknown, full of clicks and tones, drifted across the water like wind through reeds. Leif ordered caution. He stepped forward, arms open, offering gifts, beads, cloth, and iron tools. The Skraelings hesitated, their curiosity warring with caution. Some smiled briefly, others retreated into the shadows of the trees. The encounter was tense, a fragile bridge between worlds. Here were people who had lived in this land for generations, while the Vikings were intruders, daring to tread where no Norse foot had gone before. As the days passed, the interactions shifted. Some skirmishes flared, missed arrows, startled animals, and a clash of customs, but there were also moments of fascination. Leif observed their hunting methods, the way they built temporary shelters, and their deep knowledge of the forests and rivers. The Skraelings were wild yet wise, fierce yet careful, a mirror of the untamed land itself. Even as he marveled, Leif sensed the stakes. Vinland's beauty came with peril. The land was generous, but not forgiving. The people were wary, yet not cruel. Each encounter, each gesture, each glance was a test of courage, of patience, of diplomacy. And for Leif Erikson, the line between explorer and conqueror, between friend and foe, had never been so thin. Here, in this mysterious forested paradise, a new chapter of Viking history was being written, a chapter of discovery, of wonder, and of the first real meeting between two worlds that would forever remain entwined in legend. Leif Erikson and his crew had stepped beyond discovery. Now they faced the true test of endurance, survival in a land untamed. Vinland stretched before them like a living tapestry, dense forests that whispered secrets, rivers shimmering with fish, and fields of soil so dark and rich it seemed to pulse with life. Every dawn brought the scent of pine, the cry of unfamiliar birds, and the glimmer of the sea against golden sands. The Vikings built their first longhouses from timber felled from the great forests, walls strong against wind and rain. Smoke spiraled from their hearts, mingling with the scent of earth and sea. They hunted deer and gathered berries, learned to fish the rivers thick with salmon, and discovered medicinal herbs that eased wounds and fevers. Life was a constant rhythm of labor, of mastering a land that was generous yet relentless. Leif walked among his people with quiet authority, his eyes always watching the horizon and the forest edge. The Skraelings remained nearby, observing the newcomers, sometimes trading furs or fish for beads, sometimes retreating into the shadows. Trust was fragile, every gesture carried weight. A stray arrow, a misinterpreted smile, could ignite conflict. Yet, in these small settlements, a strange harmony grew. Children laughed as they chased the foxes, men sang as they raised timber, and Leif recorded the land in careful detail, its coastlines, its forests, its rivers. Every day was a discovery, a lesson, a story to carry home. But the wildness of Vinland was never far away. Winters brought harsh winds, storms tested the sturdiness of their dwellings, and mysterious sounds in the forests reminded them that this land had a life of its own. Survival required not just strength, but patience, cunning, and respect. Here, at the edge of the world, Viking courage met untamed wilderness. Vinland was not merely a place, it was a living challenge, a testament to the human spirit's reach beyond fear. And at the heart of it all, Leif Erikson's dream had taken form, an outpost of Northmen in a land that no Viking had ever claimed before. Vinland's beauty belied its dangers. The forests, lush and inviting, were also home to silent watchers, the Skraelings, guardians of the land, wary of the newcomers. For days, trade and cautious observation held, but missteps soon sparked conflict. An arrow fired too close, a misunderstanding over hunting grounds, and suddenly the fragile peace trembled. Leif Erikson moved swiftly, balancing the line between diplomacy and defense. His men, seasoned by storms and battles, readied their shields and axes, yet Leif urged restraint. The Skraelings were nimble, unpredictable, and knew the land as no Viking could. Every encounter was a test of strategy and courage. The forest itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, shadows shifting as if alive. Nature, too, tested them. Sudden storms battered the coastline, waves hurling longships like toys, while frost and biting wind reminded the settlers that comfort in Vinland was fleeting. Rivers swelled, threatening to wash away their tools, and animals unfamiliar with Viking hunters sometimes struck with deadly swiftness. The settlers learned quickly, survival demanded respect, not domination. Amid the tension, Leif's leadership shone. He negotiated, offered gifts, and sought understanding with the Skraelings, hoping to build a fragile trust. At night, fires flickered along the shorelines, smoke curling skyward as both Viking and Skraeling watched each other warily from the trees. In those silent moments, Leif felt the pulse of Vinland, the heartbeat of a land alive, aware, and unwilling to be tamed. Through trials and clashes, the settlers grew wiser, learning the rhythms of forests and rivers, the subtle signals of wildlife, and the intricate dance required to coexist with the land's original inhabitants. Leif's dream of a thriving colony had never felt more real, yet he knew the cost of overconfidence. One mistake, one moment of pride, and the fragile promise of Vinland could crumble like frost under the morning sun. The Saga of Vinland was no longer just a journey across the sea. It was a test of courage, wisdom, and endurance, where every dawn demanded vigilance, and every night whispered the mysteries of a world untouched by Viking hands. After weeks of cautious exploration, Leif Erikson finally led his crew to the heart of Vinland, a land of unimaginable richness. The forests opened to meadows drenched in sunlight, rivers teeming with fish that sparkled like molten silver, and soil so dark and fertile it seemed almost alive beneath their hands. Wild grapes hung in thick clusters, berries ripened in the sun, and game roamed freely, unaware of the newcomers watching from the tree line. Leif walked the land slowly, breathing its scent, pine, earth, and the distant tang of the sea. His mind raced with possibility. Here, the Vikings could settle, build homes, and thrive. Here, the soil could feed families for generations, and timber could construct longhouses stronger than any in Greenland. Every discovery was a jewel. The meadows promised crops, the forests timber and firewood, the river's endless bounty of fish. Vinland was more than a destination. It was hope incarnate. The men shared in Leif's wonder. Axes rang as they felled timber, Nets swooshed through sparkling rivers, and longhouses rose, timber by timber, like dreams turned to reality. Even the Skraelings, cautious and watchful, began tentative exchanges, bartering furs and food, their curiosity mingling with respect. The land's richness seemed to offer a fragile peace. At night, Leif stood atop a hill overlooking the settlement, the wind tousling his hair. He imagined generations of Vikings living here, children playing in the meadows, families flourishing by the rivers, stories of adventure passed down with every sunset. Greenland had forged him, Norway had guided him, but Vinland held a promise beyond imagination. Yet he knew, as always, the land demanded vigilance. The Skraelings were unpredictable, the sea unforgiving, and winter would arrive eventually, harsh and relentless. But for now, Leif allowed himself a rare smile. The dream he had carried across the ocean was taking shape before his eyes. A colony, a foothold in a new world, a beginning that no Saga had yet chronicled. Vinland was alive, wild, and beautiful. And at its heart, Leif Erikson's vision, bold, daring, and eternal, was becoming reality. Even the most beautiful lands bear hidden dangers. Vinland, with its sun-drenched meadows and dense forests, soon tested the Vikings in ways no sailor had imagined. The Skraelings, once distant observers, now challenged the newcomers more openly. Arrows whistled through the air, spears glinted in sunlight, and the settlers realized that curiosity could swiftly turn into confrontation. Leif Erikson met each threat with a mix of caution and strategy. He understood that brute force alone could not secure Vinland's promise. The Vikings built palisades along the shorelines, established watch posts, and organized patrols, all while seeking to learn the language and patterns of the Skraelings. They observed, they negotiated, they prepared for moments when survival demanded decisive action. Nature itself was a relentless teacher. Sudden storms lashed the coast, rivers swelled and threatened to wash away their crops, and wild animals tested the settlers' courage and skill. Nights were long and cold, shadows danced ominously across the forest floor. The settlers learned to read the subtle signs of the land, broken branches, the distant howl of wolves, the flight of birds signaling danger. Yet within these trials, Leif's leadership shone brighter than ever. He guided his men with patience and insight, balancing fear with courage, aggression with diplomacy. Each skirmish with the Skraelings taught them respect for the land and its guardians. Every storm survived reinforced their unity, their resilience, and their belief in Vinland's potential. Through hardship and conflict, the colony grew stronger. The settlers learned that Vinland's gifts came only to those willing to understand and endure. The clash of cultures, the raw power of nature, and the fragility of life at the edge of the known world combined to forge a saga unlike any other, a story of bravery, wisdom, and the unyielding human spirit that dared to tame the wild unknown. With Vinland's shores behind him, Leif Erikson guided his longships back across the North Atlantic, the wind and waves now allies rather than adversaries. The forests and rivers of the new land lingered in his memory, the dark soil, the sparkling waters, the wild grapes hanging in the sun. He carried not just stories, but evidence, timber, furs, and tales of a fertile world untouched by the hand of man. Greenland rose from the horizon like a grey fortress. The icy cliffs welcomed him, the fjords whispered of home, and the longhouses were filled with settlers eager for news. Eric the Red, older now, his hair silvered by frost and years, met his son on the shore. There was a moment of silence, a meeting of fire and foresight, before pride and admiration passed between them. Leif recounted Vinland in vivid detail: the towering forests, the rivers thick with fish, the strange people who watched from the shadows. He spoke of the wealth of the land and the dangers that lay in its untamed heart. Men listened, wide-eyed and restless, imagining themselves walking through meadows far beyond the edge of the known world. From Greenland, Leif sailed to Norway, carrying his stories to King Olaf Tryggvason. In the royal hall, he laid out maps and sketches, gifts from Vinland, and the tale of a land brimming with promise. The king, ever ambitious and inspired by tales of the unknown, saw the potential for expansion, faith, and glory. Leif had not only discovered a new world, he had planted the seed of exploration and ambition that would echo through generations. Yet Leif himself understood the delicate balance. Vinland was a gift, yes, but fragile, a land to be respected, not conquered. Its forests, rivers, and people demanded reverence. He had glimpsed the edge of the world and returned to share it, not as a conqueror, but as a herald of discovery. And so, across the fjords of Greenland and the halls of Norway, the legend of Vinland began to spread, a whisper that would one day become a saga, carried across oceans and centuries, telling of a Viking who dared to follow the horizon where no man had gone before. Leif Erikson's return stirred more than admiration. It sparked dreams. Greenlanders and Norsemen alike were captivated by tales of Vinland: fertile soil, towering forests, rivers overflowing with fish, and a land still wild, untouched by the hand of man. Leif knew, however, that mere tales were not enough. The dream required action. A permanent settlement, he decided, must be established. The planning began in earnest. Ships were built larger, provisions were gathered, and skilled men and women were chosen for the journey. Builders who could raise longhouses, hunters who could sustain life in unknown forests, and navigators who read the stars like runes, all were summoned. Leif's vision was ambitious, not just a temporary outpost, but a thriving colony capable of enduring winters, resisting hostility, and forging a bridge between worlds. Yet the challenges loomed large. The Skraelings remained unpredictable, sometimes curious, sometimes wary, their arrows a reminder that Vinland's lands were not unclaimed. Nature itself conspired. Sudden storms threatened ships, rivers swelled, and winters were long and cruel. Leif's men trained relentlessly, learning the rhythms of the forests, rivers, and tides. Every task was a lesson, every failure a warning. Despite the hardships, hope flourished. Leif guided expeditions into the interior, mapping forests, rivers, and valleys. Meadows were cleared for crops, timber felled for construction, and alliances with friendly Skraelings explored cautiously. Each journey inland revealed both promise and peril, the land offering sustenance while demanding respect. In the evening, around the fires of Vinland's first settlements, stories were told not just of past deeds but of future dreams. Leif's vision burned brightly, a colony that would endure, a foothold in a new world, and a testament to the courage of those willing to step beyond the horizon. The saga of Vinland was only beginning, and with each passing day, the legend grew richer, filled with the promise of adventure, discovery, and the unyielding spirit of the Vikings. Vinland, for all its promise, was not a land tamed by hope alone. As the days passed, the settlers faced trials not only from the wilderness and the Skraelings, but from within their own ranks. Hunger, fatigue, and fear began to gnaw at morale. Disputes over hunting grounds, disagreements about building priorities, and whispers of dissent grew like shadows along the rivers and in the longhouses. Leif Erikson felt the weight of leadership more keenly than ever. His vision of a thriving colony was tempered by the reality of human nature. Some men longed for the familiar comforts of Greenland. Others questioned his judgment, skeptical of a land so distant and wild. Yet Leif moved among them with calm authority, listening, mediating, and reminding them of the bounty and promise that lay just beyond immediate struggle. Nature, too, refused to yield. Sudden storms battered the longhouses, rivers overflowed, and predators stalked the edges of settlement. One night, a pack of wolves, bold and hungry, attacked the outskirts, testing the settlers' vigilance. Another day, a violent tempest nearly claimed the ships docked at Vinland's bay. Each challenge forged stronger bonds among the men, yet also revealed the fragile line between survival and catastrophe. And still, the Skraelings watched. Their presence was a constant reminder that Vinland belonged not to the Vikings alone. Occasionally, trade continued, furs for iron, berries for tools, but tension simmered beneath every encounter, a quiet threat that could ignite at any misstep. Through it all, Leif remained steadfast, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew that every trial, every conflict, every moment of fear or disagreement was shaping not just the colony, but its story. Vinland would not be conquered by force. It would be claimed by perseverance, by wisdom, and by courage, the virtues that had carried him across oceans to the edge of the world. And so, amid storms, skirmishes, and human discord, the saga of Vinland continued to unfold, a tale of ambition, endurance, and the delicate art of turning dreams into reality. As the settlement stabilized, Leif Erikson led daring explorations deeper into Vinland's heart. Beyond the familiar meadows and rivers, forests thickened, ancient and unyielding. Moss-draped trees formed towering arches, hiding sunlight and secrets. Here, the land whispered of its untamed spirit, of riches and dangers entwined in equal measure. The Vikings discovered vast groves where wild grapes hung heavy, berries ripened in abundance, and herbs of striking potency grew among ferns. Streams sparkled with fish that leapt like silver fire, while hidden valleys offered soil rich enough to feed generations. Each discovery inspired awe and hope. The land's gifts seemed endless, a paradise for those bold enough to claim it. Yet Vinland was not without peril. Mysterious caves appeared along riverbanks, their dark mouths promising shelter or death. Strange footprints and signs hinted at wildlife more cunning than any the settlers had faced. Even the Skraelings' occasional presence reminded the Vikings that they were guests, navigating a realm that was neither tame nor entirely known. Leif meticulously documented these findings. Every grove, river, and cave was recorded, every encounter noted. Maps grew detailed, sketches illustrated resources, and plans for expansion began to take shape. Vinland was revealing itself slowly, its bounty intertwined with its enigma, demanding patience and respect. At night, by the firelight of the longhouses, the settlers spoke of what they had seen. Tales of untamed forests, sparkling rivers, and hidden treasures wove into the collective memory. Children listened wide-eyed, men planned journeys, and Leif envisioned a colony that could harness Vinland's wealth while honoring its wild spirit. Vinland's riches were not merely of soil or timber, they were a test of vision, courage, and wisdom. To survive here was to understand the delicate balance between ambition and humility, between the hunger for discovery and the reverence owed to a land that could give life as easily as it could take it away. The first true winter in Vinland descended with a force none had anticipated. Frost crept across the meadows like a white serpent, rivers froze into gleaming mirrors, and snow buried the settlement until the longhouses seemed like lone islands in a sea of silence. The abundance of autumn now felt like a distant dream. Hunting grew scarce, fishing lines froze, and even the forests, so alive with game, fell eerily still. Inside the longhouses, the fire's glow fought desperately against the icy breath of the season. Men huddled together beneath furs, their voices low, their hearts heavy. Food stores dwindled, and what little remained was rationed with stern discipline. Hunger sharpened tempers, and disputes flared like sparks on dry kindling. Isolation pressed upon them as heavily as the snow. The sea, once their road of freedom, was now a prison of jagged ice. No ships could sail, no escape could be found. Each storm that roared over the settlement seemed a reminder that Vinland was no gentle paradise, but a stern mistress demanding sacrifice for every gift she offered. Leif bore the weight of despair on his shoulders. He walked among his people, steady and calm, speaking words of hope, even as doubt gnawed at his soul. He reminded them of the sagas of their ancestors, who had endured harsher winters in Greenland and Iceland, who had crossed seas without compass or map. He told them that endurance was their greatest weapon, that to outlast the winter was to claim Vinland truly. Yet not all hardships were born of nature. Illness spread quietly through the colony, stealing strength and courage alike. Some settlers whispered that the land was cursed, that the spirits of Vinland rejected them. Others clung to faith in Odin, in Thor, or in the White Christ, praying for deliverance. Still, amid despair, a flicker of resilience remained. The Vikings, bound by their unyielding spirit, refused to bow. They sharpened their blades, mended their ships, and swore that when spring returned, they would rise renewed, stronger for the suffering they had endured. When the harsh grip of winter finally loosened, the land of Vinland awoke in a blaze of green and gold. Rivers broke free from their icy prisons, forests sang with birds once more, and meadows bloomed with life. Yet for Leif Erikson and his people, the season of trial had left deep marks of hunger, loss, endurance, and hard-won wisdom. Leif gathered his settlers and spoke plainly. Vinland was a land of promise, vast and untamed, rich beyond measure, but also cruel, testing the very limits of human strength. It was not yet time to conquer it fully. To survive, they must return to Greenland, to tell of what they had seen, and to inspire future generations to follow. So they prepared their ships, loading them with timber, furs, and grapes, the treasures of Vinland. With heavy hearts and hopeful eyes, they pushed their longships once more upon the sea. The winds that had once guided them west now carried them east, toward the familiar shores of their homeland. Behind them, Vinland remained, shrouded in mist and legend, waiting for those bold enough to seek it again. When Leif at last returned, his tale spread like wildfire. Around fires and in great halls, men listened in awe as he spoke of the new world, of wild grapes, endless forests, and winters that could crush even the strongest. Vinland became more than a place. It became a dream etched into the heart of Norse culture, a beacon of exploration and courage. Leif did not return to Vinland, but his journey ensured that he would live forever in saga and song. Though centuries would pass before others dared cross the ocean again, his name endured, whispered in the same breath as the greatest heroes of the North. And so it was that long before Columbus set sail, a Viking had already touched the edge of a new world. His legacy was not just discovery, but the eternal spirit of adventure, the call of horizons uncharted, where courage meets the unknown. Leif Erikson became more than a man. He became a bridge between worlds, a keeper of the dream of Vinland, the land of promise, the land of legend, the land that forever bound the Vikings to the story of America.